Mr. Fallon. In 2015, the Conservatives made a solemn promise to the electorate about the size of the armed forces. Can you remind people what that promise was?
Yes, we said we would build the army up to 82,000 by the year 2020.
And what is the size of the armed forces now?
It's coming up. It's just over 79,000.
So you have not kept that promise?
We haven't got there yet. It's not 2020 yet. We said for the 5 years of the Parliament, we would build up the armed forces, including reserves. We would get reserves up to just over 30,000.
You said, well, the quote was that we were going to maintain the size of the regular armed services and not reduce the army to below 82,000. The current figure is 79,000 of a regular army, so you have broken that promise.
Well, we said we'd do this over the Parliament, and we're spending a lot of money on
But
recruiting.
you haven't reduced the army. Well, you said you wouldn't, and you have.
Well, we're increasing the size of the army up to 2020. There are 3 more years to go until 2020. We have recruitment campaigns going on. We're increasing the size of the Royal Navy. We're increasing the size of the Royal Air Force. And we're determined, of course, to improve the offer we make to our servicemen and women to attract the best of each generation to join.
Because at the moment your recruitment is going badly, you're not getting enough people into the army. You were meant to get 9,500 in this year, it's 6,000, and you're going backwards, not forwards.
No, I don't accept that. We are getting more people to join up, both regulars and reservists.
You say you don't accept that.
We have several years to go before we reach our target, but we are spending more on the armed forces. The defence budget goes up every year, and we're giving them the new equipment that they need.
Well, you said, I don't accept that. I don't accept those figures. Let me give you them again. The target was 9,580 people to join the army last year, and the figure you achieved was 6,900. And that is why the top brass are so worried about you and worried about the army under you.
Well, first of all, we can't force people to join the army. We don't have conscription in this country. The army has to compete with other sectors of the economy. So that was a silly
promise, perhaps, in the first place?
No, it was a promise over the Parliament, over the 5 years. We're only 2 years into the old Parliament, and I can assure you we are spending a lot of money on recruiting, but also on giving the armed forces the equipment they need. You've seen our aircraft carriers being built up at Rosyth. There are new frigates on the way to cut steel on in July. We're buying new aircraft, and we're investing in the equipment they need.
Now, you've said that you're going to increase defence spending by 0.5% above inflation. Yes. How much does that cost?
That costs roughly over the 5 years of the new Parliament, added to the 2 years of the last Parliament. That gives the armed forces roughly £1 billion more than they would have had if we'd simply met the 2% target.
So where does the money come from?
The money comes from a growing economy. It's a commitment we made. It's a choice to spend more on the health service, to spend more on defence, and we've reduced spending, as you know, in other areas.
So this is an unfunded commitment?
No, it's
going a bit Diane Abbott.
No, it's absolutely funded. It's not a wild commitment. It's properly financed, and we can afford to do that.
From where? Because the money has to come from somewhere.
It comes.
Is it more borrowing, or is it more taxes, or what?
Well, borrowing is slowly going to be reduced, but it comes from a growing economy, is the real answer to your question. Because we're running the economy efficiently, because the economy is growing each year, more people in work, we have more revenue coming in, and we're able to make choices, not wild spending or borrowing promises like Labour, but to spend more on the NHS, to spend more on defence, the things that people really care about.
That's the extra billion. Now, according to the Defence Select Committee and the Times newspaper, there's a black hole in your equipment budget of between £7.5 and £10 billion. How are you going to fill that?
Look, we're planning the biggest equipment programme in generations. As I said, new aircraft carriers, new frigates, new maritime patrol aircraft, new planes to go on the frigates, new armoured vehicles.
Okay, but it's the National Audit Office, actually.
Let me answer it. You asked it, let me answer it. That is a 10-year programme, and part of the cost of that programme has to come from efficiency savings, getting rid, for example, of land and barracks and buildings that we don't need, being more efficient in the way that we work.
Now, we have to deliver £7.3 billion of getting rid of fields.
7.3 billion over the 10-year period, over the 5-year period, of efficiency savings on top of the efficiency savings we've already made. Now, that means if you've got airfields you don't need, you shut them down and you release them for housing.
Airfields, Mr. Fallon.
Well, we have 60 airfields. We don't need 60 airfields. You have to look at what you don't need. You have to be more efficient as a large organisation and look at ways of working. And it's absolutely right that to invest in that programme, we have to reinvest the efficiency savings that we make. And the big change in the last few years, by the way, is that we keep all of those efficiency savings. The Treasury doesn't come and nab them back.
All right. Well, you haven't persuaded your top brass. You haven't persuaded senior military people who wrote a letter to the Prime Minister recently. Let me read you a little bit of it.
Sure.
It says, says that your statements about the defence budget have been disingenuous, quoting irrelevant financial statistics. And they go on to say, the government boasts of spending 2% of GDP on defence. That's widely criticised as an accounting deception. The armed forces are having to seek further, very damaging savings in manpower, support and training at a time when the likelihood of combat operations is increasing.
The 2% figure is not our figure, it's the NATO figure. It was
no, but
confirmed...
it's the way you've met it that they're criticising.
No, on the contrary. It is the NATO figure. The Secretary-General of NATO, Stoltenberg, was in London this week, seeing myself and the Prime Minister, and he confirmed publicly that according to the NATO definitions, we are meeting the 2%. In fact, we're meeting nearly 2.2%. It is other countries that are not spending up to the 2%. He has confirmed that our spending is defined according to the NATO guidelines.
But these are former chiefs of the defence staff. These are guys covered in brass.
Have you ever met somebody covered in brass, a former defence chief, who doesn't want more spent on defence?
So they're just rattling the tap.
They are passionate about defence, and so am I. I'm proud that the defence budget is increasing this year. It was 35 billion last year. It's 36 billion this financial year. It'll go up to 40 billion over the next few years, and we will be investing in the biggest equipment programme the armed forces have seen in generations. Now, to do that, we also have to be more efficient about the way we work.
What patently this government has not properly invested in is defences against cyber attack. You did not give the NHS the proper support and the proper money to stop this cyber attack, with terrible results for patients up and down the country.
In our security review, just over a year and a few months ago, we identified cyber threats as one of the three principal threats, and we set aside £1.9 billion to protect us better against cyber, and a large chunk of that went to the NHS.
We're spending you didn't pay for the upgrade in 2015.
Hang on, we're spending around £50 million on the NHS cyber systems to improve their security. We have encouraged the NHS trusts to reduce their exposure to the weakest system, the Windows XP. Only 5%, less than 5% of the trusts actually use that system anymore, and there is money available to strengthen these systems.
But you did not pay for them to strengthen that system at the crucial moment in 2015, did you?
That was an old system. We didn't want them to use that. We wanted them to use modern systems that are better protecting. No, we warned them, and they were warned again in the spring.
So it's
they
were
warned again of the threats.
Not of the government, is that what you're saying?
Well, we all have to work at this. The NHS wasn't particularly targeted. The same attacks applied to Nissan on Friday and in other areas of the economy, and indeed around the world. But let me just assure you, we are spending money on strengthening the cyber defence of our hospital system.
Is it the case still that the nuclear submarines, the Trident submarines, are using Windows XP?
No, we never comment on the different systems, obviously for reasons of security, that our submarines use.
Well, they better not be.
But our Vanguard submarines, I can absolutely assure you, are safe and operate in isolation when they're out on patrol, and I have complete confidence in our nuclear deterrent.
So there is no possibility of a malware attack against the military as we've seen against the NHS?
I can assure you the nuclear deterrent is fully protected.
Let's talk about you talk about the nuclear deterrent. You used a strange phrase a little while ago when you said that you, in certain circumstances, you thought we would use first strike in nuclear weapons. Can you explain what those circumstances
Yes, the key to the nuclear deterrent is to leave uncertainty in the mind of any potential adversary if he's looking at a country to attack as to exactly what kind of response he can expect. It's to leave ambiguity in the mind of your enemies, and that's why we never rule out whether we would apply first strike or not.
So you can imagine actually using nuclear weapons before anybody else has?
Well, we use them every day, Andrew, every night.
Not like I'm talking about.
Well, what I'm talking about, we use them as a deterrent.
Things.
Yes, but the job of the nuclear weapon is to deter. It's done that successfully for over 50 years since we've had our submarine fleet.
See, you've been very, very critical of Labour on the nuclear issue and defence generally.
And rightly. Look at that policy.
They might say that the problem with your side is they want to talk first and bomb later. You always want to bomb first and talk later. No. Can I ask you, is there a single war since the Second World War that you haven't been in favour of?
Well, we obviously, when we voted on the Iraq War, war, we were under the impression given by the then
But you
Labour
voted
government...
for it.
I voted for it, like a lot of MPs, because we were told there were weapons of mass destruction there. And it turned out, actually, there weren't.
Were you wrong, and do you regret voting for that war?
Well, I regret the prospectus on which it was embarked. It was right.
But you regret voting for it?
Well, hang on. Yeah, I regret voting for it on the basis there were weapons of mass destruction, because they clearly weren't. But we were dealing with a dictator who had invaded other countries, and we were part of an international coalition. And the problem with Labour's approach is they're now saying they would never commit. And you even heard Emily Thornberry now suggesting they might negotiate over the Falklands. I think that's shocking.
Well, let's turn to another war that you supported. You're very much in favour of use of force in Libya. And let's read you again the Foreign Select Committee report on what's happened in Libya after the war that you were so keen on. It resulted in political and economic collapse, inter-militia and inter-tribal warfare, humanitarian and migrant crises, widespread human rights violations and the spread of Gaddafi regime weapons across the region and the growth of ISIL in North Africa. In short, it was a total disaster, and you voted for it.
Well, the reason for it, if you remember, was to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in Benghazi, where an entire city was potentially going to be wiped out. That's why we had the intervention. Now, you're right. When you do intervene, we need to learn the lessons of each of these conflicts, that there needs to be a proper plan for stabilisation afterwards. I've been working with other defence ministers in the coalition for precisely that in Iraq, after Mosul is eventually liberated, that we stabilise these areas and bring in security after the war is over, to ensure that the Sunnis there, for example, have a proper stake in the running of their country.
One domestic question, if I may. You've launched a new housing policy, council housing policy this morning. There are two small gaps in that policy so far as we can see so far. How many houses and how much money?
Well, the money is coming from the 1.4 billion we earmarked for capital expenditure from the autumn statement last year. So the money is there.
It's not new money. You're taking it from something else.
Well, it's not new money, but the amount of money for each council will depend on the deals we strike with places like Manchester and Birmingham to get more social housing built in these areas of a high enough quality that tenants eventually will be able to buy. It's a very attractive policy that will give people a real alternative to waiting to get into a council house or a flat of their choice.
Well, you and Emily Thornberry are coming back in a little while for a love-in, but for now, thank you very much indeed.
I'm not sure about the love-in.